Meet Minoto. He spent 16 years working in the South African government. In a meeting with an executive coach, he presents a familiar persona: highly educated, professional, and speaking carefully polished English. Beneath that exterior is a deep frustration. Decades after the citizens in this line cast their ballots for liberation in 1994, the government systems Minoto served are struggling to meet the needs of those same people. Minoto notes that the public sector lacks an existential threat. In the private sector, failure leads to bankruptcy. In government, officials often receive bonuses regardless of service delivery. This insulation creates a disconnect between the bureaucracy and the street. In legacy institutions, Black leaders often face a pressure to assimilate rather than the organization adapting to their humanity. Minoto describes the result as becoming a coconut, adopting the culture of the institution, while the core of the person is pushed aside. Attempting to rebuild a nation requires moving past the institutional behaviors and psychological frameworks that defined the era of oppression. When professionals feel they must leave their humanity at the door to fit in, they often carry the weight of an inferiority complex inherited from colonial history. Mtunto observed a lingering habit of deference to white counterparts, noting a lack of confidence compared to peers from African nations that achieved liberation decades earlier. This gap explains why many initiatives for service delivery improvement falter. They focus on the mechanics of systems and processes, bypassing the psychology of the people. Success in the public sector is tied to the psychological health of its leaders, yet this internal trauma often goes unaddressed in official policy. During their conversation, the coach, David, asks Mtunto to stop speaking his polished English and instead repeat his story in his native isiXhosa. Mento's demeanor shifts instantly. He becomes animated and passionate, describing the experience as speaking the language of his soul. This shift illustrates the core of recovery coaching. David explains that recovery is frequently misunderstood as a process limited to stopping substance abuse. In this framework, recovery is the act of getting back the authentic self that an addiction or an oppressor took away. For Mento, speaking his native tongue was an act of reclamation. It allowed him to access the truth that the corporate environment had suppressed for 16 years. Professional growth begins with stripping away the mask to recover a person's authentic voice. This approach maps the behavior of individual recovery onto the trauma of a colonized society. Many government policies target systemic change while bypassing the psychological recovery of the individuals who must implement those changes. Relying solely on academic models of psychology can be ineffective when those models do not account for the specific environment and history of a traumatized population. To build recovery capital, the mentors and leaders must come from the communities they serve, bringing their own lived experience to the work. Institutional reform depends on addressing the trauma of the people within the institution. Minto argues that analyzing poverty from a boardroom or a television studio lacks the necessary perspective for real change. The reality of the townships is sensory. It involves the smell of the waste, the sight of children without clothes, and the constant threat of violence on the street. Understanding a population requires leaders to physically immerse themselves in these conditions, rather than observing them from a distance. Minto defines servant leadership through the 5 senses, the willingness to smell the shit and touch the faces of those living in these communities. When leaders undergo this physical and psychological shift, their motivations move from self-interest toward a shared sense of responsibility. Healing begins when leaders leave the isolation of the tower to reconnect with the reality of the street. Back on the Zoom call, David and Mkwento reach a point of deep mutual understanding. Then, without warning, Mkwento's screen goes dark. The connection is severed, and David is left asking what happened to his student. The call was cut short by the same fragile infrastructure and power grid issues they had been discussing. The work of recovery remains in progress, frequently interrupted by the very failures it aims to address.